I took that winter job mostly because I was broke and desperate, not because I liked being alone in the mountains. It was early January 2018, and I'd been hired by a small real estate company in Pike County, Kentucky, to inspect old hunting cabins that hadn't been used in years. My job was simple: photograph the interiors, check for mold or damage, and report back. The snow that week was brutal. Thick, heavy flakes that swallowed up every sound. The roads were so narrow that my tires left the only tracks for miles. I drove an old F-150 with a busted heater, bundled up in 2 coats, drinking coffee that went cold 5 minutes after pouring it. That morning, I reached a cabin marked Ferguson Lot 9. It sat deep in the woods, past a frozen creek and surrounded by black skeletal trees. The place looked untouched for decades. Roof half collapsed, a deer stand leaning against the side. When I stepped inside, my flashlight beam cut through the gloom and hit dust dancing in the air. Everything was still. No footprints but mine. The living area was empty, except for a rusted stove and a few broken chairs. But when I opened a small door in the corner, I found what looked like a pantry, or maybe a storage closet. The shelves were lined with glass jars, each filled with a yellowish liquid. At first, I thought they were animal specimens, frogs, snakes maybe? But as I got closer, I saw a human ear, a finger with chipped pink nail polish, and what looked like an eye floating near the bottom. I froze there for a good minute, just staring at those jars, trying to convince myself they were props or medical samples left by someone decades ago. But they didn't look old enough for that. The liquid was clear, not clouded like something that had been sitting for years, and the skin still had color. I remember this awful, sterile smell, like bleach mixed with something sweet. My stomach turned and I stumbled out of the cabin to catch my breath in the freezing air. I snapped a few quick photos for proof, thinking I'd show them to my supervisor later, but even that felt wrong, like I was violating something I shouldn't have found. The snow was falling harder by the time I made it back to the truck. My hands were shaking too much to light a cigarette. I sat there for a while, just trying to calm down, listening to the radio static. Eventually, I convinced myself to go back in before leaving, just to make sure I hadn't imagined it. When I returned maybe 2 hours later, the air inside felt heavier. My boots left prints over my old ones, and I noticed something immediately. There were more jars. The shelves were fuller. I counted at least twice as many, each lined up neatly, like someone had been organizing them while I was gone. And on the top shelf, there was one jar that hadn't been there before, a cloudy one with something pale and small floating inside that looked disturbingly like a human tooth. I froze there for a good minute, just staring at those jars, trying to convince myself they were props or medical samples left by someone decades ago. But they didn't look old enough for that. The liquid was clear, not clouded like something that had been sitting for years, and the skin still had color. I remember this awful, sterile smell, like bleach mixed with something sweet. My stomach turned and I stumbled out of the cabin to catch my breath in the freezing air. I snapped a few quick photos for proof, thinking I'd show them to my supervisor later, but even that felt wrong, like I was violating something I shouldn't have found. The snow was falling harder by the time I made it back to the truck. My hands were shaking too much to light a cigarette. I sat there for a while, just trying to calm down and listening to the radio static. Eventually, I convinced myself to go back in before leaving, just to make sure I hadn't imagined it. When I returned maybe 2 hours later, the air inside felt heavier. My boots left prints over my old ones, and I noticed something immediately. There were more jars. The shelves were fuller. I counted at least twice as many, each lined up neatly, like someone had been organizing them while I was gone. And on the top shelf, there was one jar that hadn't been there before. A cloudy one with something pale and small floating inside that looked disturbingly like a human tooth. I backed out slowly, not even realizing I was holding my breath until I hit the front door. The snow outside had gotten so thick it muffled everything.
No birds, no wind, just that dense white silence. I slammed the door behind me and hurried to the truck, boots crunching on ice. The whole way back down the dirt trail, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone coming out of the trees. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over, got out, and scraped the ice off my windshield with my bare hand, just to stay busy, just to do something. I told myself I'd report it to the sheriff once I had service again. But deep down, I already knew I wouldn't. Something about that place felt older and meaner than anything the cops could deal with. It was getting dark when I finally got cell signal near town. I parked at a gas station, went inside to grab coffee, and when I came back to my truck, that's when I saw it. Sitting right on my dashboard, half fogged from the cold, was one of those damn jars, same kind of glass, same yellowish fluid, and inside it was a single ear, the one with chipped pink nail polish, the one I'd seen first. The lid was wet, like someone had just set it there. I looked around the lot, but there wasn't a soul in sight. Just my own footprints in the snow leading to the truck. That's when my hands went numb, not from the cold this time. I didn't even think. I grabbed the jar with my jacket sleeve and hurled it into a snowbank behind the station. The glass cracked but didn't break all the way. I could still see the liquid leaking out, seeping into the snow. I jumped back in the truck and peeled out of there, spinning the tires until I hit pavement. Every instinct told me to get out of those mountains as fast as I could. My headlights flickered once, twice, like they had trouble cutting through the storm.
For a second, I thought I saw something move in the ditch beside the road. A shadow, bent low, almost crawling, following the truck as I sped past. I told myself it was just the snow playing tricks on me, but my gut didn't buy it. When I finally reached my rental place that night, I parked 2 streets away and sat there with the engine running, staring at the dashboard. I checked every inch of the cab, under the seats, the glove box. Nothing. The jar was gone, and so were the photos from my phone. Every single picture I'd taken that day had been replaced with blank gray squares. I quit that job the next morning without saying a word to anyone. Sometimes I still dream about that closet and the sound of glass tapping together. I can almost smell that bleach and sweet mix when it snows heavy outside. Maybe someone was collecting trophies, or maybe the mountain keeps its own kind of record. I just know that whatever was in those jars wanted to be remembered. Story 2. I was working seasonal maintenance for the forestry department that winter, clearing fallen trees, marking washed-out trails, and keeping campsites safe for the spring hikers. It was January 2020, and I had been assigned to Black Hollow Reserve, a stretch of forest tucked deep in the western Appalachians of Virginia. Most people didn't even know it existed. It wasn't on any map you'd find at a visitor center. My supervisor, an older guy named Rick, gave me a map and circled a few key areas to check, then tapped his pen hard on one spot near the bottom. "Stay clear of Pine Gulch," he said. "Ground's unstable, not worth the risk." His tone made it sound more like a warning than a safety tip. That first day, the woods was silent, in a way that only snow-covered mountains can be. Every breath came out in clouds, and my boots crunched like breaking glass. I set up camp near an old ranger post, a few miles from the boundary line. As the sun dipped, the forest turned into a blur of blue and gray, my lantern throwing long, shaky shadows across the snow. I cooked a can of chili, zipped up my tent, and tried to sleep. But around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps circling my camp. Slow, deliberate crunches in the snow just outside the tent fabric. I froze, holding my breath. Then silence. I waited maybe a minute before unzipping the flap, shining my flashlight out. Nothing. Just perfect, untouched snow under the trees. The next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. My lantern was gone. It had been hanging right beside the tent door, and now there was just an empty hook and a faint impression in the snow where it used to be. No footprints, no drag marks, just smooth, undisturbed snow all around, as if the wind had erased everything overnight. I checked the tree line, thinking maybe an animal had taken it, but there was no sign of movement anywhere. The forest looked frozen in time. I packed my gear fast, feeling watched the whole time, and decided to stick to the map trails for the rest of the day. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about Pine Gulch and why Rick had sounded so uneasy when he mentioned it. By the third night, I'd convinced myself I was just overreacting. Maybe I'd misplaced the lantern or knocked it over in my sleep. I had finished clearing one of the lower paths and stopped to rest at a clearing where the pines opened up to a valley below. My radio crackled a few times, but no one was there. The air was still, heavy with that electric quiet that comes before snowfall. I took a few photos of the area for my report and packed up before the light faded. When I got back to camp, something was sticking out from under my tent flap, a folded piece of damp paper. I opened it and froze. It was a printed photo, slightly blurred, showing me crouched near my own camp working on the tent. But in the background, behind the trees, there was someone standing. Or maybe something. I stared at that photo for a long time, trying to make sense of it. The figure in the background looked too still, almost like a shape carved out of shadow. The weirdest part wasn't even that someone had managed to take the picture. It was the snow. Every inch around my tent in the photo was pristine, smooth, untouched. No footprints leading in or out. I turned in circles, scanning the trees, my breath fogging in the air. The forest was dead quiet again, that kind of silence that presses against your ears. I ended up building a small fire just to have some light, but every flicker of the flame made me feel like something was shifting just beyond the reach of it. The next morning, I packed up everything and radioed Rick that I was cutting the job short. He didn't sound surprised, just told me to leave the equipment by the ranger post and not to look back. When I
Out, I passed the trailhead for Pine Gulch one last time. Someone, or something, had stuck my missing lantern on a branch by the sign, still burning faintly in daylight, the glass frosted over. I didn't stop to check it. I just kept walking until I reached the road, and I haven't been back since. A week later, I got an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was another photo, same shot of me at my camp, but this time the figure in the trees was gone. Story 3. I'd been a forest ranger in the southern Appalachians for almost 8 years, but that winter in 2019 was the coldest I'd ever seen. Temperatures dropped below zero every night, and the ridge lines disappeared under a constant layer of fog and snow. Late one afternoon, I got a distress call over the radio, a weak signal from a hiker who claimed she was lost somewhere near Frost Hollow Trail. Her voice kept cutting in and out, words dragged and static-filled, but I caught something about a light and the trees moving. The signal faded before she could give coordinates. I logged the call and headed out immediately, thinking it was just another disoriented hiker who had wandered off trail. By the time I reached the ridge, the fog was so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. My boots sank into snow that squeaked under each step, and the only sound, besides my breathing, was the wind whistling through the pines. I kept checking my compass. It spun in lazy circles, refusing to point north. That had never happened before. I switched to my GPS, but the screen just blinked a message I'd never seen. No data. I told myself it was the cold messing with the signal, but unease was creeping up fast. After what felt like an hour, I realized I'd been walking in a loop. The same broken tree, the same fallen log. I was circling the same patch of woods without meaning to. I decided to stop and set up camp before I completely lost daylight. The fog had turned a pale blue, and the snow reflected it like glass. I pitched my small tent near a rock outcrop, lit my portable stove, and radioed in my location, though the signal barely went through. As I settled in, I thought I heard faint voices in the distance, soft, stretched out, like someone calling for help underwater. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the mist, but the sound stopped immediately. Only the quiet hiss of falling snow remained. I went back inside, zipped the tent, and tried to shake off the feeling that the mountain itself was listening. Sometime during the night, I woke up to a strange flicker outside. At first, I thought it was my own lantern, but when I peeked out, there was another camp just down the slope. Same tent model, same lantern glow, even the same outline of footprints leading toward it. I shouted, thinking maybe another ranger had joined the search, but there was no response. The fog shifted, parting for a moment, and I saw something that made my chest tighten. That tent wasn't just similar, it was identical. Same color, same patches on the fabric, same gear bag by the flap. It looked like my camp, down to the smallest detail, duplicated in the snow. I grabbed my radio, trying to call in, but all I got was static. The fog seemed to thicken around that second tent, swallowing sound and light. My boots crunched over the fresh snow as I approached, heart hammering. When I peeked inside, my stomach dropped. There was my own ranger vest, my flashlight, even my thermos sitting exactly where I had left it. It didn't make sense. How could everything be replicated perfectly, yet I hadn't been here before? I stumbled back, tripping over a root, and when I looked again, the second tent was gone. Nothing but untouched snow and that same heavy, suffocating fog. By morning, I had no choice but to follow the trail back the way I thought I'd come. Every turn led me to the same spot, the same fog-draped trees, the same icy silence. Hours later, I finally emerged near the ranger station, exhausted and shivering. I told my supervisor what happened. He frowned but didn't press for details, just told me to log it as a lost hiker search. Weeks later, I still can't explain it. Sometimes I swear I see that duplicate tent in my dreams, just a shadow among the pines. The mountains never gave me an answer, but I've stopped going near Frost Hollow alone. Some places in the Appalachians don't like being found, and I've learned to respect that.